Thank you, Adam, and welcome to everyone. It's exciting for us. This is our first of our URJ faculty webinar series, and we will be doing this series once a month for the coming months as a chance for us to meet just some of the remarkable thought leaders, academics, and activists and communal agitators who are in our faculty. For those who don't know, the URJ has created this faculty to really bring together some of the best and the brightest in Jewish life, people who really are the people who shape their respective fields. Some of our faculty members are full-time faculty members, like Rabbi Edie Mencher, who will be facilitating, moderating our webinar tonight. Edie's area is sacred community and caring community, and she works full-time as a part of our URJ staff. There are other people who are full-time shaping the Jewish future, whether it's in an academic setting or in a congregational or an institutional Jewish setting, or even beyond the Jewish community. And we've asked people who literally know things that no one else knows so that we could bring that knowledge, that new way of practicing and thinking to our congregation and to our leaders. So tonight we have Dr. Ari Kelman, who many of you may know from some of his writing. He is co-author of a really important new book. It's called Sacred Strategies, and it really looks at synagogue transformation. He co-authored the book with Larry Hoffman, Issa Aaron, and Steve Cohen, and it really is a model in showing us the way congregations move from functional, meaning doing some of the more important but mundane tasks, to really shaping a whole visionary congregation. And so Ari really helped with his co-authors to delve into what really makes synagogue change effective and what shapes the kind of synagogue that we could imagine for the 21st century. Ari is the Jim Joseph Professor of Jewish Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford University, and a wonderful, wonderful scholar and teacher. And we're very honored to have Ari with us tonight and to have Ari as a member of our URJ faculty. We're also very honored that Rabbi Dan Judson is with us. Dan is finishing a PhD with Jonathan Sarna at Brandeis University. He's ordained by the Reform Movement and has been researching money and synagogues, really the ways in which synagogues have organized themselves for not just the last year or two, but really going back, looking back centuries to see what are the ways that congregations have done their work differently, and how have some of the through lines maybe helped us to shape the synagogue of today, but even more importantly, the synagogue of tomorrow. Some of our additional faculty members, we have almost 36 in the URJ faculty, are people like Larry Hoffman and Ron Wolfson, who founded Synagogue 2000 and now Synagogue 3000. People like Joe Reamer, who really has pioneered the whole field of informal education at Brandeis. People like Liz Lehrman, one of the most important contemporary Jewish artists. People like Rachel Cowan and Nancy Flam, who lead the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, or Yehuda Kurtzer, who comes to us from the Shalom Hartman Institute. We have really remarkable people. So I just would point out that next month, in February, we're going to have a chance to learn with Lisa Colton, who has been pioneering the use of technology in Jewish life. And she's going to be joined by Allison Fine, also a member of our URJ faculty, who's really an author and teacher on the power of networks. How is it that we gain insight and understanding from a variety of not just individuals, but institutions, and how do we share that knowledge in effective ways? So we're going to each month take not just the scholars who are quite compelling, but also the subject matter that we know to be very, very front and center in Jewish life. And tonight's subject is new models of membership. You may have seen, although probably only those who regularly read the Washington Post, this past Friday there was a piece by Lisa Miller called Young Jews Rebelling Against Paying Dues. And it's a piece about our URJ. It's a piece about congregations that are being creative about new models of membership and new models of dues. So we're living through a moment of experimentation and a moment of some new thinking. And tonight we'll be thrilled, I know, to enter the world through these three wonderful, wonderful teachers, scholars, and leaders. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Rabbi Edie Mencher, who will then pass it on to Dan Judson and Ari Kelman. And you all have the chance to ask questions at any point along the way. So it could be just in the opening few words you have a question. Go ahead and type it in, and we'll do the very best we can to have those questions answered during the course of the webinar. Rabbi Edie Mencher.
Thank you, Rick. It's really a privilege to begin this series of webinars with this first one that is addressing how do we understand membership today with all of the tensions and pressures that you've mentioned, and how do we sustain these congregations financially. And a very good place to begin is to ask the question of how did we get to this point? Why are the models that characterize our congregations now the ones that are in place? And so I'd like to turn to Dan to ask to begin to give us something of that history.
Great. Thank you, Edie, and thank you, Rick, for the invitation to address everybody tonight. It's really a privilege to speak to so many lay leaders of the Reform movement. So as Edie mentioned, we are going to begin this evening by taking a kind of a look back. The reason we're going to spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes looking at the history of synagogues and financing. The reason I want to begin by looking back, and we most certainly will get to looking forward this evening, but I want to begin with a brief tour of history, just so we really get a sense that the membership and financial models in synagogues today is not from Sinai. It's not always been the way it's been in America, and I think this alone should have hopefully will free us to be thinking in different ways by recognizing that synagogues have done a few different things over the course of American Jewish history to fund themselves. So I'm going to do this pretty quickly, and hopefully it'll be interesting. And so you'll see in front of you, if you're looking at the slide, you'll see a slide that says Congregation Shaareth Israel, New York City. And Congregation Shaareth Israel is America's oldest congregation. Founded in the 17th century, still existing today on the Upper West Side of New York City. And Sally, if you'll turn the slide, I want to show you, this is from 1747, and I just want to show you that in 1747, you see a little entry of people's names with numbers beside them, and we're not going to read it, but on the left-hand side, you can kind of quickly get a sense of it. This is in 1747, Congregation Shaareth Israel had the idea that they were going to shift the way that they funded their congregations from something kind of like dues, a yearly subscription, to a poll tax, an income tax. And on the right-hand side is how much each person in the congregation was going to be charged. Just if you're a history nerd like I am, and you want to get a sense of this, each shilling there is worth approximately $200. So you can see the average income tax was around, in today's dollars, around $800–900. Some people who had a lot of money were paying significantly more, but it's interesting to note that in 1747 we had a poll tax, an income tax, as the way synagogues raised money. However, 3 years later, Sally, if you'll turn the slide, they changed to selling seats. In a synagogue in 1750 in Shaareth Israel, what they would do is, just like for me, because I'm in Boston, it's the Patriots or the Red Sox, or like any sports team, they would sell a seat to you, and that would be your seat, and nobody could sit in that seat except you. Even if there was just a few people in shul on a particular Shabbos, it was your seat. And they would auction off the seats, and the closer you sat to the action, as it were, the more your seat cost. And they would keep some seats in the back of the synagogue open for visitors from out of town, or for those who could not afford to pay for these seats. And so, Sally, if you'll turn the slide again. Sharth Israel, after they instituted in 1750 paying for seats, over the next 50 years, they went back and forth about 5 times in whether they wanted to have pay for seats or have an income tax. And ultimately, in 1805, you see their constitution in front of you, they decide that never in the history of the synagogue would they have anything other than paying for seats. And that was really set the first, in the 19th century, synagogues paid for themselves primarily through paying for seats, which is what, I should add, churches did as well. Churches and synagogues shared this. In America, churches at this time were funded very much primarily in 2 ways. They, as I mentioned, they sold pews as well, and some churches in America were established, meaning that the state actually in the colonial era paid for the church. But synagogues never had that luxury. The government was never going to pay for synagogues. So right away, when we came to America, we had to become adept at figuring out how to fund ourselves. And in large part because we saw some churches with this model of funding through paying for seats, we took on that model. And you see in the 19th century, almost every synagogue in America funds themselves by the closer you are to the action, the more seats would cost. And that's how we did it for about throughout the 19th century. I would add one other way we raise money, and I say this to lay leaders across the country, and I would encourage, if you want to bring this back, as another way that synagogues would raise money beyond paying for seats as additional funds, is that they would fine anybody who refused to serve on the board or refused to become the president of the synagogue if they were asked. So I just want to throw that out there. If possible, something lay leaders sometimes want to bring that back when I bring that to their attention. Into the 20th century, you see in front of you in the slide that Sally just put up is Adat Israel. And Adat Israel is in Louisville, Kentucky, and it is a shul that nowadays has merged. It's got a longer name attached to it. But I've been in the archives of Adat Israel, and I wanted to just show you the moment when synagogues moved to the dues model. So in the 18th century, synagogues, as mentioned, either had income taxes or they sold seats. In the 19th century, they sold seats. And in the 20th century, they stopped selling seats and they moved to dues. And I just want to show you how that happened. You'll just forgive me, my computer for a moment went offline. Okay. So you see in front of you something from the Adat Israel's board meeting. This is from 1920, and what they suggest is that the synagogue should move away from selling seats because people are no longer interested in selling seats. More people are interested in paying dues because they say, and this is kind of very interesting from a historical perspective, they say that there's something more democratic about being able to pay, there's something undemocratic, about paying for seats, and the closer you are, the more you pay. There's something really undemocratic about that, and they wanted to switch to something that would seem democratic and something that would seem egalitarian. So they switched to this model, which we now have, called dues. And you'd have a yearly assessment, and it would not entitle you to a seat. It would just entitle you to this thing called membership in the synagogue. And this is really when membership takes on a slightly different hue. Previously, membership was you'd get a seat in the synagogue, but now membership meant it would entitle you to being part of the synagogue and access to all the programs and things that went on in the synagogue life, and didn't necessarily and would come with high holiday tickets, I should say, but synagogue membership at this moment in 1920, and this synagogue is one good example of it, changes. So if you can turn to the next slide of Stephen Wise. There was one synagogue, though, that had a different model. And Stephen Wise is the rabbi starts his own synagogue in New York City in 1905, which still exists today, called the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. And the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue was free for a few, he said, for a few different reasons. He, Stephen Wise, rejected the idea that people should pay dues at all and rejected the idea of paying for seats. So the synagogue is free because people were free to come and could sit wherever they want and not have to pay dues. They would pay based on what he said was going to be the volunteer goodwill offerings. Stephen Wise had many powerful friends who had a lot of money at their disposal and was able to successfully make this synagogue happen without people paying anything to belong to it. A small cadre of people paid a lot of money, and other people were able to become part of the synagogue as a result of that. And that's how the synagogue financed itself. But Stephen Wise's insight is one that I think has come back around, which leads me to the present day and new models of synagogue membership. If you're still with me, that is Stephen Wise's model of a free synagogue, a synagogue where people primarily are asked to give of what they can of their own free will, is a model that has come back around. And one of the things I've been looking at now is about 7 synagogues across America that have moved to this model in the past few years, and have really made an impact and been able to change the culture of the synagogue in some interesting ways, has been good for their bottom line, and has allowed their synagogue to really stabilize themselves, both financially and culturally in difficult economic times. So the model of dues is a model that is most synagogues are currently using, but I would suggest is not going to be the model that most synagogues are going to be using in the long term. That is, I think, just as the 18th century had, the 19th century had selling seats and the 20th century had dues, I think we're going to come back around in the 21st century to Stephen Wise's model of a free synagogue, where people are going to be moving toward synagogues membership and culturally based around asking people to pay what they can afford. And there's lots more to be said about that. And Edie, I don't know if we want to get into that now or if you want me to talk about other models, but why don't I stop there as kind of introductory remarks.
One of the things that I wanted to note was that as you drew our attention to the shift from paying for seats to first the model of any seat being available to any person regardless of their social class or what they could contribute, and then the further addition of the notion that in no way should money interfere with anyone's attendance at synagogue seems to reflect the adopting of a belief that the way synagogues supported themselves and the way people were seated should reflect the deepest values, the deepest vision of a Judaism that was rooted in this sense of equality before God, but also influenced by the social tenor of the time, with discomfort with some who were seen as having their status as lesser because of their economic position. And I think it is interesting that we live at a particular time now when we are responding both to economic realities, but also something in our social scene that suggests that this kind of stratification is not in keeping with our vision of modern Jewish life. And As you talk about some of the new models that are being proposed, I wonder if you could also address yourself to how those models are also reflective of the core sense of mission of those congregations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is well articulated, Dee. What I would say is, listen, there's a model, the model of paying dues to belong to an institution is a close parallel to a club, and I think it strikes people at this moment that a club is the wrong kind of model for an institution that is meant to be engaging and embracing and reaching out. That the country club model, where membership is based on an ability to pay, just is not in keeping with what I think our contemporary mores are. Whereas if we put an emphasis on engagement first and reaching people and caring about their lives first, I think the money aspect will follow that. That is, what some of these models that I think are going to be the future take away decouple membership and money. That is, that the sole basis for membership in an institution would be money. And it's going to change that by saying the basis of membership in an institution is going to be commitment and engagement. And I think that is much more in keeping with where the American Jewish community is at this moment than a kind of older country club model. And I know when I say things like that, people get worried that somehow if it becomes about engagement and dues go away, then there's no possible way bottom lines could be met. But I disagree completely with that, and think if we actually focused on engagement in a more significant way and told compelling stories about why synagogues are institutions that are deserving of support, people will feel enormously better, actually, about giving to synagogues. And I have, as I said earlier, I've seen synagogues make it work. I've seen synagogues that have made this change and have done it with great success. So I do think, Edie, that the coupling of membership and money solely is not in keeping with where we are as a Jewish community.
Some of the questions that are being posed by our listeners and participants reflect the very real concerns about how congregations manage to sustain themselves, particularly in difficult economic times, if they do not rely upon fixed dues.
Yeah, so I think that's the question. You know, I look around at a lot of synagogues, though, and I was just in New Jersey speaking to about 25 synagogues 2 weeks ago, and asked them, you know, if all things being equal, if their current demographics remain the same, how many of them are going to be financially viable in 5 years? And it's a pretty random, I had a pretty random sampling. I was at the New Jersey Federation, and I would say of the 20 synagogues that were there, roughly half said that they just simply weren't going to be viable. So one of the questions that arises for me is not only can synagogues sustain themselves without dues, but it is synagogues, even with the dues structure, are finding themselves more and more unsustainable. I presume that's why so many folks are on this phone call this evening, because there's such concern about how dues are going to be able to sustain synagogues. So I think it's both sides of the question. It's how can you survive without dues, but are synagogues surviving with dues? And I think for many synagogues, the answer at the moment is no. I think can you survive without fixed dues, as I've already said. I mean, there's a deeper process, which we don't kind of have time to get into tonight, about how these synagogues particularly have done it. But I think the short answer, again, is you can absolutely survive. People, when asked, when said, how much does this synagogue matter to you? Synagogues that are good synagogues, that have something to offer people, will be met if people are given the opportunity to contribute at the level to which they feel comfortable. If a good synagogue approaches people and says, we'd like you to make a gift of the heart, people will respond. I mean, we kind of know that. I think synagogues are just afraid to let it happen because they're afraid of that they'll be met by silence on the other end, but it's just not true. If your synagogue is a synagogue that you have members that care about it, they will come through for you. And I think the environmental changes that a change in financing, this change in financing will have other, will change the culture, will help change the culture, will create a better environment, which I think will only help with membership and finances.
You know, some of the questions that are being posed, I want to tell people who are on the call that I am trying to condense and ask, since I can't ask all of them, to somehow address to Dan and to Ari the essence of what's being asked. So clearly one question is, as you pointed out, congregations cannot, many of them, cannot prove to be continuously viable with the current model. I think that one question that's coming through loud and clear is that are there congregations that have found themselves solvent, able to make a budget, able to plan for salaries, programs, maintaining their buildings, using a model where they are not certain of what dues will come in, and not dues, but when people assess their own capacity to contribute, how has that worked out? Can you, without going into an entire explanation of the mechanics of this, can you give us an example of what's happened in any one congregation, just so that people see this as more than an ideal, but something that really can be
Sure. So just to condense, Edie, one is none of the congregations that have moved to this model leap into the abyss of having no idea of what's going to respond to them. And I wouldn't encourage anybody to hang up from the phone and say, that's it, we're done, we're just going to move tomorrow. Of course, nobody's going to do that. But these congregations that do it effectively have reached out to and done engagement work with a large number of their own membership to say, if we move to this model, can we count on you to contribute at a level that will sustain this congregation? So nobody jumps into the abyss without having some sense that people will stand by and are ready to commit to it. So there's a level of groundwork that happens in anticipation of such change, which just makes good financial sense. The other thing I would say is that the synagogues that have moved to this model also, they don't simply say to their congregations, let's, whatever you simply comes to your heart. They give a number that says, this is how much it costs for us to run the synagogue. And they're telling a story that if you pay this much, if you can give us this much, we are able to continue the programs that you are appreciative of. Our staff is going to be continue to get paid. That is, they give a number that's some sort of sustaining number so that they know that the budget can work out. But the important thing is they give that number, but then there's no abatement committee. There's no group that is going to look at what people respond to and say that number you need to give more, or there's no group that you have to go to with the tax form in hand, or there's no group that you have to in any way pass what your level of commitment is to the synagogue. So the synagogues have a number in mind which they ask of people, but then there's not the key part of this is there's not a group that's going to look over people's shoulders in any way. And I think that's what so many people find difficult in contemporary synagogues and in a dues model often is to have an abatement committee of some sort looking over your shoulder. And so that's one of the key findings from all of these synagogues, that getting rid of that committee can do wondrous things for people's goodwill and allow this kind of model to take hold. So I don't know, Ari, if you want to jump in at some point to either poke holes in what I'm saying or challenge or provoke in some way to push us in a different direction.
Ari, I wanted to leap in here and suggest that from our previous conversations, I'm aware of your thoughtfulness about a topic I'm going to raise now. People have asked, how does a synagogue begin to uncouple the link between the idea of membership in the community and money? And for me, this is a very profound question, the question of how meaningful it may be for people to realize that their shame is, they're not going to be made to feel ashamed. No one is going to question their right to be there or ask them to prove need. We've also talked about, and here in the questions being asked, an anxiety about how much people in the community will value their membership if they're allowed to voluntarily assess this. So in our previous conversations, you have spoken about the importance of making sure people feel that there's something they want first. Could you speak some about this?
I'll speak a little bit. First of all, I'm incredibly happy to be here and to hear Dan give the history of this, because for me, one of the values of studying history is learning that the things that look so natural today and that we take so for granted today as being essential elements of our life have not always been that way, and Dan's presentation earlier laid that out for me really clearly. As far as the question about sort of decoupling money from membership, it seems that already happened. In Dan's history, and Dan, please jump in if I'm off base here, it seems that when congregations in 1920 went from buying a seat to buying membership, there was a significant decoupling that happened at that moment where I imagine if you're selling memberships that are tied to specific seats, you can only sell so many memberships because there's only so many seats one could sell. And now we know that most congregations have membership rolls that far exceed the number of seats in the synagogue building. And the number of new synagogues built over the last decade or two even said, like, we have memberships of 1,000, but we know that on a Saturday morning or Friday night, we're only going to get 200 or 300 people. So we're going to build a sanctuary that works for 50 weeks out of the year. And then for, the high holidays, when we get the big attendance, we're going to go somewhere else anyway. So there's already, I think, an awareness that membership and money have been decoupled, are decoupled. They're both sort of abstract. Membership, anyway, is kind of abstract. One joins the synagogue for any number of reasons, not least mostly having to do with having access to clergy for religious services. I don't mean worship services, but weddings and burials and bar mitzvahs and so on. So already the idea of what membership means is in this context, and what community means in this context is sort of abstract. The synagogue is a kind of technology for facilitating community, but how it facilitates community is not, I think, a foregone conclusion. I think Dan's presentation spoke really strongly to that. As far as the power of voluntarism goes, Dan spoke to this on our conversation earlier, but I can speak to it as well, and that is that most churches structure membership around voluntary contributions, and some of the churches where I've had the opportunity to do research, they pass to have on Sunday morning something that wouldn't be either culturally or religiously appropriate in many synagogues. But certainly, and that voluntary contribution is what sustains the synagogue. And they also have, sustains the church. And of course, they have fairly robust, development teams at work as well, but synagogues are going to continue to do that work, and as they always have. So the one doesn't preclude the other. But my point is that the churches have long been based on voluntary membership in churches, or at least financial support of churches, have long been voluntary in nature, not duty. And while I hear the reticence of lay people and community leaders, synagogue leadership to head down this road, not knowing what to head, I actually think Dan's comment earlier also is spot on, that the first step is to assess the congregations, not assess them in the country club sense of the term, but assess them in terms of what are people prepared for, and then to not think of this as kind of a radical shift that you're going to wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden, get rid of the Tuesday structure that you know and swap in the voluntary one. But nor am I necessarily a champion of the voluntary structure, but it seems that it's part of an ongoing conversation about the values of the congregation. Money as a stand-in for value is a funny thing because it is both entirely abstract and very concrete. You need to turn the lights on, you need to pay the professional staff. So for me, the connection between the concreteness of money and the abstractness of memory has happened, like it happened a long time ago. Whether the question is about moving from voluntarism, moving from mandatory dues to voluntary dues is, I think, part of a longer process. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But I'm not necessarily, you know, my job here isn't to champion voluntarism over mandatory dues. In a piece that I wrote recently for SHMA, I sort of played with the idea of the 75% of people who pay for, who happily pay year after year for services they don't use, who happily pay synagogue dues, and don't regularly take advantage of the services that the synagogue provides. And I don't necessarily think that synagogues, if they shift to a these are people who are moved for whatever reason to pay what I've heard variously referred to as Jewish taxes or Jewish insurance policies or whatever. But they're doing it voluntarily anyway. They're not getting any immediate services out of it. So I think moving toward a voluntary structure makes a whole lot of sense to me. As far as concrete next steps, I'm actually the wrong person to ask. I don't work in a synagogue. It's not my sort of area of expertise. I would turn that back to the synagogue professionals to do.
Ari, I just wanted to ask you to expand on something that you just spoke about, though. If I understand it correctly, you are saying that what is important right now is in the conversation isn't what the model of sustaining the congregation is, whether it's voluntary dues, fee for service, or having a certain proportion of the congregation paying for much more than they actually participate in. What you are saying is that there is something about this conversation that is vital, which is to get a sense of what the people in the community, if I'm understanding correctly, what is of importance to them, what is of meaning, and how we, and unless we address the questions about how we support the synagogue and why people are willing to support it, we don't have the information we need to move forward in transforming synagogues. Is that fair to say that this is an important part of the conversation in developing a vision of something that is going to be meaningful for the Jewish future?
I think so. I mean, for me, as somebody who's not a member of a congregation, I would expect that to be the first order of business of any congregation. Dues, again, whether they're voluntary or mandatory, whether you buy a seat or you, you're taxed on you're asked to sort of tithe or pay a percentage of your income. Those are representations of one's commitment to the community, and so for me, the question of what motivates people to join synagogues, particularly those people who don't actively engage in synagogue life on a regular basis, is crucial to understanding why and how the synagogue functions in the way that it does. Just because synagogues could get away for the last 20 years not asking those questions, or 30 years not asking those questions, doesn't mean that they shouldn't start asking those questions now, and indicated when he, with his informal poll of New Jersey synagogue.
It's occurring to me that it's possible that we will not always be able to rely upon there being 75% who are willing to support synagogues in which they have less involvement. So the question I would like to turn to is how membership, how the way we sustain our membership is linked to what our understanding of membership is. In other words, I think the sense that people will voluntarily pay, or that they will be engaged in figuring out how to sustain the synagogue, is dependent upon a sense that they really do belong. Membership can be acquired by paying a fee and meeting certain requirements for who is allowed to join, but a sense of belonging only emerges when we feel known and cared about and have some vital need met, a need for to feel inspired, to feel cared about and supported. How have these changes that are undertaken by some synagogues, and I would perhaps address this to Dan, again, how might congregations look to making those links between how they are supporting themselves financially and how their communities are being transformed?
It's a good question, Edie. I'm reminded of somebody I've met through the course of this research is the vice president of a Reformed synagogue in Santa Cruz. A guy named Scott Roseman. I don't know if he's on this phone call even. He told me this story that when he's one of the Reformed synagogue in Santa Cruz is one of the synagogues that has moved to this model, and I would highlight them as a really interesting synagogue. They've moved to this model, that is, they've gotten rid of dues. He told me it came, this kind of flash of insight happened when his wife, who at the time was not his wife yet, called the synagogue, and I guess she had, I'm telling his story for him, but she had two children and was divorced at the time, and called the synagogue about joining the synagogue, and they weren't. He said that she wasn't very far along in the conversation about joining the synagogue and having Jewish education for her children when the subject of kind of how much money she could afford to pay quickly came up as the conversation about joining the synagogue and membership. And it struck him as just a conversation that was all off when it came to Jewish values. That in a first phone call where a single mother was calling, was kind of struggling to provide Jewish education for a child, it's not that money shouldn't have come up at all. It's just that the conversation quickly became about how much money and what level of commitment they were going to be able to make. And he just felt that something kind of had fallen off there. Something was amiss in the way that synagogues were engaging people around their own values, around what synagogues recognize themselves as key, crucial values of engagement around education, children, continuity, these kinds of values. So this is what this kind of little, it sounds like a small story, but it really led him to think of financial models in a different way and push the synagogue towards this new model of getting rid of dues, precisely because there was something about membership that it felt to him had gotten the synagogue too lost in conversation about money and not enough on Jewish values. So I think that again the Jewish values are, and I don't need to articulate the Jewish values, they are remain fundamentally important about what it means to be part of a community, as you said, Edie, to be known and heard and recognized, and a place to be cared for and care for others. All those things are, always have been, and should remain the core of Jewish values. It is how can we support them and create institutions which will allow them to flourish. And so I think that kind of financial models, which is a piece of allowing engagement to take place in a deeper way.
So
is that, Edie, did I get that? Was I answering your question there?
Yes, I think so, and I think that we want to make sure that we don't create a false dichotomy here, that indeed synagogues do need to sustain themselves. So many questions have arisen about how would religious school be supported, and also a kind of discomfort with the idea of being fee for service, because for many people listening and for many of us, there is a vision of larger embracing Jewish community that is more than the particular event in which people involve themselves. But what I think is being said here is not that we look towards not asking people to contribute, because of course that's necessary, but that you are suggesting perhaps that before we ask for the people to pay, that we be certain that what they're experiencing is perhaps a welcome that isn't happening in the office where you sign up and fill out financial forms first. I think that some of what's coming across here is that one of the reasons to shift the way we address paying dues is so that the message people get in the larger community, and even within the community that already exists, is that their presence in the community, their emotional needs, their spiritual needs, their educational needs, all of this are vitally important, and that they won't be turned away, and that we want to hear about that first. And then, Ari, I've heard you speak about this in the past as well. It is when we know that we are cared for and there's something that is deeply meaningful to us that we are more able to understand what's involved in supporting that something. And I wonder if, knowing this and that that's the backdrop of what we're talking about, I'd like to turn back to some ideas that each of you have. I know that, Ari, you're not involved particularly in the structure of congregational life now, but Dan, you are, and I guess I wonder if you could address some of the questions about why this is different. Some people have asked, how are voluntary contributions actually different than dues? What is fair share the same thing as paying what your heart so moves you to do?
Yeah.
Could you just be a little clearer about those distinctions?
Great. Great. I'm going to start doing that any moment now, Edie. Here we go. The distinction between voluntary fair share and what should we call regular dues is at one level kind of subtle, or it is simply the following, that in what I'm calling the voluntary dues system, you, as I mentioned before, you get rid of an abatement committee. You articulate very explicitly that synagogues have financial needs that have to be met, or they're not going to be able to function as the sacred communities we want them to be. But you explicitly tell people that their gifts are gifts of the heart, and that their gifts are ultimately what they are going to value the synagogue, not the number necessarily that the synagogue has said, you must pay this, and if you don't, we're going to have a conversation in some way. That even the most menschlich congregations that say, it doesn't matter how much, if you come and you tell us you don't have any money, that's fine, we still are going to embrace you. Even the most menschlich congregations that have some process where people have to go to be abated, it turns people off. And so I have this, every time I make this presentation, there's always somebody who asks exactly this lovely question of, well, basically we do this. We have dues, but we're very, we love everybody and we're a great congregation. We've got our heart in the right place. And so people come to us and they say, we can't afford anything. We always just say, it's no problem. And it's great. That's great. I think it's lovely for generosity. I do think, though, that inevitably, whether they realize it or not, my experience is that there are some people for whom they just simply do not want to ask people. They don't want to go to anybody to tell them that they're not going to be able to afford what the synagogue has asked them to pay. The fair share system is very related to these things. I think most people are probably aware of fair share is where synagogues peg a certain percentage of income. They ask for dues based on a certain percentage of people's incomes. And this is another model which I think is worthy of a lot of attention. The difference between that and fair and the voluntary system that I'm talking about, again, is this question about abatement, that even in congregations that are fair share congregations, you have people often, usually the numbers are between 20 and 25%, 15 and 25%, are people who come for an abatement. And the interesting thing about fair share is it's often can be people of all different economic strata who are coming for abatement, not just simply people who are at the low ends being unable to afford what synagogues ask. And Fair Share, I think, works for a lot of congregations and has some ideological values to support the idea that people should pay based on what they can afford. I think these free will synagogues are different in the fact that they really want to make it so that congregants do not feel in any way pressured by the synagogue to indicate to the synagogue how much money that they actually make. There's a congregation near me in suburban Massachusetts that was going to move to a Fair Share model, but the congregation said we just don't want to tell the synagogue how much money we make, which would base the Fair Share value of. And I understand that. That makes a lot of sense to me. That telling congregants people are very private about their money, and we want them to be of goodwill, and somehow it's a little off-putting to tell a congregation how much you make for them to base their Fair Share value on. So I think Fair Share has a lot to be said for it, and for some congregations it's going to be a financial model that works for them. But there is a distinction between that and the kind of voluntary system that I've been talking about this evening.
In a moment, we're going to turn to Rick to help us to take some of the questions being asked and some of the richness of what's been discussed here and contextualize it in light of a vision for our Jewish future. I would like, before I turn this to Rick, to note that some of what Dan has been speaking of is the very strong need for a sense of dignity and autonomy that is not surprising, but that absolutely characterizes so many of the people who come into our synagogues, and we're working together to try and evolve ways that we can be sensitive to all of these needs, but also sustain ourselves. Rick, in a moment we will turn to you. I want people to know that this is a beginning conversation. We don't expect people to leave this conversation knowing exactly what they will do, but to have new ways of thinking about things and to know that the union is going to continues to offer resources to further these conversations. There is a community of practice that will be beginning shortly, addressing new models of membership. For those who might like to participate in that, they need to be in touch with Vicki Farhi at the union this week. And in the coming months, there will be other opportunities for people to be engaged in an active learning network regarding membership and engagement, and there'll be more information about that. I'd like to turn now to Rick, and we really welcome your thoughts.
Thank you, Rabbi Edie Mencher, and thank you to Dr. Ari Kelman and to Rabbi Dan Judson for a very, very enlightening and provocative presentation. And to all those on the call, you can see by the number of questions and the level of detail in the questions that this is a very live issue for all of us. And I think what Dan and Ari have done is sort of take us by the hand and take us for a little walk into the Jewish future. Again, there's no absolutes in that Jewish future about the way synagogues are all going to fund themselves. But it was, I'm sure, eye-opening for all of us. And for some of those on the call, there are very specific questions that were asked. And I felt a little bit like the famous Talmudic question that Rabbi Shammai asked, or was asked by a potential Jew by choice. So teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. And Rabbi Shammai says, well, I can't do that, and chases the man away, where Rabbi Hillel says, well, while I'm standing on one foot, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary, and I go and study. We are operating with the theory of change. Actually, how do we take on? Many of your questions that were asked were very, very tangible questions. How do we start doing? How do we explore? How do we test? And I want to really lift up the model of a community of practice. We're beginning in March a community of practice, which is a group of congregations that will literally band together and will be guided by people like Rabbi Dan Judson and others to be very, very strategic and thoughtful and reflective about any experiments that would be conducted. For example, maybe a congregation is going to experiment with voluntary dues, but only for 20s and 30s, or maybe voluntary dues only for young families joining the Early Childhood Center. So the idea is that this is really complicated. This has lots to do with all the greater kind of cross currents in Jewish life. So this is not where we can give you everything in 1 hour or, frankly, in 2 hours. But this is the beginning of the unfolding of the ways in which we're going to test which ideas have staying power. One of the questions that was asked was, surely this is not for small congregations. Surely this is only for large, well-funded congregations. But it turns out that when I was at the Scheit seminar last April, I met the president of Temple Brit Achim in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, which I can tell you is not one of our large congregations, one of our small ones. And since 2010, they have been operating with a voluntary dues system, and they're learning as they go. The idea of a community of practice is we learn as we go, and we share what we learn with other congregations. So we're not just, off in one part of the North American continent doing an experiment and not aware of what's going on in another part, but we're literally banding together and being very, very thoughtful and methodical about what we try, how we evaluate what we try. So I would say to some of those on the call tonight, you may want, with your fellow leaders, to consider entering a community of practice on reimagining financial support for your 21st century congregation. You can learn more about this community of practice on our urj.org website, if you look at that community of practice. The actual deadline was on Friday, but we knew that this call was taking place tonight, and it might be the catalyst for some congregations to think this is something we really want to dig deeply into, and we want to learn with other congregations that are serious about digging more deeply. I would also just point out that for those who are not part of the community of practice, we're going to share everything that's learned. So with Dan and with Ari and with Edie, there's lots of wisdom, but we're going to know more as these community of practices literally test out some of these models and really refine them. So it's a new Jewish world that we're living in, and there are challenges everywhere that we look. But we at the URJ are assembling the kinds of people who are going to help us not just conceptualize or be theoretical, but that will lead us to also practice and shape the kind of synagogue, the kind of Jewish community that we're going to be leading in the coming years and decades. So I want to thank everyone for being a part of this webinar. Know that in February we have our second webinar. It's going to be about technology and the power of networks in really gaining our strength for our congregations and being tapped into a much wider sense of possibility, the way in which we, again, not just sort of peek in the future, but really harness the various new tools that we have. And one of the greatest tools we have is the intellectual capital. And for that, I want to especially thank Dr. Ari Kelman, Rabbi Dan Judson, and Rabbi Edie Mencher. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing more from all of you on the call and having your views explored in the coming months and years as we go into all these important areas with our faculty and with all of you for the journey. So Erev Tov, good night, and we look forward to the next opportunity to learn with you.